Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us. My name is Niamh Marriot and I'm the Deputy Editor of International Cranes and Specialised Transport magazine. Today I'm joined by Chris Sleight, who is the Managing Director of Specialist Research and Forecasting Company Off Highway Research, OHR. And today we're going to talk about their latest report, the IC50, which has been created in collaboration with our magazine. Chris, thank you. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I guess we should start off by explaining a little bit about the report, kind of what it is, how long it's been going, how it's calculated.
Yeah, absolutely. So our report is called Global Mobile Crane Fleets, and as you said, it's based on the IC50, which is a league table that International Cranes and Specialised Transport has been doing every year since the 90s, in fact. So well over 20 years. And what the league table is a listing of the biggest crane-owning companies in the world, and they're ranked by what is called in the magazine the IC Index, which is the total load moment in ton meters of each company's fleet. So not perhaps the most obvious way of doing it, but it's been felt over the years that that's kind of the fairest way of doing it, to compare different fleets, to kind of look at their overall lifting capability rather than a different measure like number of cranes, although the number of cranes is quite an interesting one. So what we did in building this report was we took all the IC50 rankings that we could find going back into the 90s and put them all together in a database, and then looked at what trends would come out of that in terms of the progression and the development over time.
Yeah, sure. And so from your research, can you tell me where the big crane rental companies are actually based?
Yeah, sure. And this is quite an interesting one because it is something that's changed over the years. I think you would say that still most of the big companies are based where you would expect. So Western Europe, North America, and the developed parts of Asia. That would be the majority of them. But it has changed over the years, as I said. You get one or two very big crane companies in some of the emerging markets, countries like India, Thailand, Turkey, the UAE. Each of those tends to have one or two very big crane rental companies which make it into the IC50 listing or the top 100. And more recently, we've seen some very, very large crane rental companies emerge in China. In fact, there are three Chinese crane rental companies in the top 10 now, which have, in relative terms, come out of nowhere to rise to that level.
Yeah, for sure. And how big are their fleets? What is the typical composition?
In terms of composition, it's very much leaning towards wheeled cranes, perhaps as you might expect. The league tables don't really break down between all-terrain, rough terrain, and truck cranes and so on. But we find that the fleet composition is typically 80% wheeled cranes to about 20% crawlers. Having said that, you do get a few companies around the world which are very much specialists in crawler cranes. So that in one or two special cases, that's almost flipped on its head, which again is sort of an interesting thing about how different companies sort of find their niche in the market. In terms of fleet sizes, even in the top 100, it does vary enormously. I mean, the largest crane fleet in the world is owned by Maxim, which has more than 3,300 cranes. And this illustrates the point about ranking companies by load moment, because although Maxim has by far the largest fleet, it's only third in the listing because Mammoet and Sarans have fewer cranes, but overall much heavier lift cranes.
Yeah.
But they still obviously have very, very big fleets. There are 7 companies in the top 100 that own more than 1,000 cranes, and most of the top 20 own 500 cranes or more. So it is this pyramid effect of a few very big fleets at the top kind of tapering down, but there are a lot of companies with very, very extensive fleets in the world.
Yeah, brilliant. So looking at your report, what are some of the kind of key trends that have come out then? If you've been looking at this research going all the way back, what are the trends in the industry in terms of growth in crane numbers, growth in load moment? Is there still a clear move towards heavier lift cranes?
There is absolutely. I mean, I think the first thing that is apparent when you really dive into the numbers that come out of this is most of the top 100 companies are essentially heavy lift companies, or very much tilted towards that end. Um, in the most recent year, if you looked at how many cranes and the average load moments, you had an average load moment per crane across the top 100 of about 890 ton meters. So, I mean, that's equivalent to a pretty big crane. That would be about a 300-ton all-terrain crane, or maybe 170, 180-ton crawler crane. So that's the average, and the average is already tilted towards the heavier end of lifting equipment. So it does emphasize that overall the IC50 are heavy lift companies, really. And as you very rightly said, this trend towards heavier and heavier cranes is going on all the time.
Yeah.
One of the first things that came out of this analysis is the change in the load moment, the IC index. That grows by about 7% per year and has done fairly consistently over the last decade. But the actual number of cranes in the fleet only grows by about 2% per year.
Right.
So what that tells you is the fleets are growing, but more or less staying the same size. In fact, there's consolidation in the industry, so it does undulate a little bit. But I think much more significantly, that much steeper growth in load moment shows that the crane rental companies are absolutely trading up when they refresh their fleets. They're not necessarily growing their fleets, but they're absolutely swapping out a smaller crane for a bigger crane. Right across the board.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And in terms of features of the industry, kind of you were talking about consolidation of the fleets, but in consolidation in mature markets as well, and new players in these emerging markets as well. This is kind of what you're seeing from the report.
Yes, I mean, if you look at the top 20, it's relatively stable. About
Yeah.
15 of the companies that were in the top 25 years ago are still there. The new names are, as I mentioned before, a couple of these large Chinese crane rental companies which have come into the market. And also there has been a little bit of consolidation. I mean, it goes on all the time, but the big one that affected the top 20 was Mammoet buying ALE a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
But overall, it is relatively stable. But you do have this dynamic of in mature markets, there aren't really any major new opportunities. So you do see this consolidation. And that's something that comes out of some of the other analysis that we've done, that we really do find that crane companies are looking at their footprint, looking at how many depots they have and how many cranes per depot, and really trying to optimize that. And generally getting a bit bigger in terms of how many cranes they have at each depot. And also that's reflected in the staff numbers. There's clearly a drive to improve productivity. So you get this particularly in Europe, where you get companies with a network of fewer, bigger depots. And in terms of the number of people per depot and number of people per crane, that does edge down year on year. So all that consolidation in mature markets is absolutely about driving productivity. And then in the emerging markets, it's obviously slightly different, because you do tend to have much higher growth and more opportunities emerging year on year. So you get a completely different structure. You tend to get fewer depots that are very, very big in terms of their staff numbers and the number of cranes based at them. So some of these large companies in emerging markets may just have one or two depots to cover a whole country.
Right.
But as time goes on, you see that they tend to sort of spread their network out a little bit and go for a different kind of footprint. And that's something that comes out through this study of looking at those changes over time. And we go into quite a bit of detail on those sort of factors in the report.
Brilliant. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Chris. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks a lot. Bye.